Okay. Thank you, Fernando, and thanks to the organizers for having me, giving me this honor. I've had friends from Chile for more than 20 years, and they always told me, you have to go to Chile, and I never had the opportunity to go. And finally, I'm here, but I would have never imagined it would have been in such beautiful weather with such esteemed colleagues and such a gorgeous hall and such a good-looking audience. So I'm very lucky to be here. I will be talking about how the physics of tissues created animal form. And it's often thought that it's just genes and long periods of time that did this. And the kinds of forms that I'm talking about are this incredible variety of different organisms, maybe 35 different body plans. The vertebrates, I hope you can see this, being the one that we belong to, but there are starfish, echinoderms, and there are polyps, and mollusks, and they're all animals. And this is not even to mention the plants, which have a whole world of their own. And Darwin had a proposal for how this happened, and I would like to note the connection of Darwin to this great city. He visited here during his voyage on the Beagle. I hope he had as nice weather as we've been having. But Darwin's idea can be encapsulated by the words of Stephen Jay Gould, and it's very dependent on gradualism, a lot of small changes over long periods of time. So I'll just read this. Darwin's theory cannot be equated with a simple claim that natural selection operates. That is, some forms survive better than other forms. Nearly all his colleagues and predecessors accepted this postulate. Darwin's second key postulate was the claim that natural selection acts as the creative force of evolutionary change. As long as change accretes or accumulates in an insensibly gradual manner, that is, from one point to the other, you can barely tell anything is happening, and as long as the reproductive advantage of certain individuals provide the statistical source of change, then natural selection must be construed as the directional course of evolutionary modification. And as Darwin put it in his own words, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, but I can find no such case. Now, with all respect to Darwin, I would like to tell you in this talk how our understanding of the development of form as exemplified in this wonderful talk of Ray Keller that we heard before, and other scientists who are attending the symposium that I'm a part of and elsewhere, our understanding of the mechanisms of morphogenesis and form generation actually gives us a wider view and makes some of Darwin's hypotheses less relevant now than they were before. Now, Darwin has contemporary adherents, and Richard Dawkins may be among the most famous of them. He says evolution must be gradual when it is being used to explain the coming into existence of complicated, apparently designed objects like eyes. For if it is not gradual in these cases, it ceases to have any explanatory power at all, and it basically comes down to miracles. So that is the contemporary Darwinian, neo-Darwinian or modern synthesis view, and it carries over Darwin's ideas. But we now know that something Darwin didn't know. We know that all the forms that we see, all the animal forms, originated very rapidly, maybe in a couple of episodes of about 10 million years, starting about 600 million years ago. And these diversified very quickly And not only that, not only with a quick and a geological time scale, but the genes that are used to orchestrate and coordinate the forms of all of these different kinds of animals that you see here are basically unchanged. You can actually swap these genes between different phyla, between a fly and a mouse, and it will do the same thing. So there are other genes that have changed over time, but the ones that coordinate development have barely changed. So something else must be going on other than gene change to give you these forms, and it must have happened very quickly. Well, Gould had some other things to say about this, and he said the history of most fossil species includes two features inconsistent with gradualism. Stasis: most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. And sudden appearance, another word for this is saltation, jumps. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears at once and fully formed. Now, let's think about how Darwin saw the world. Darwin didn't want to advocate a religious or a supernatural explanation. He wanted to use material science, physical science of the time to explain the change in form. And what did he have available to him? Well, one of the things was Newtonian mechanics. Well, I can't point, but it's on the upper left. And Newtonian mechanics explained the orbits of the planets. But an interesting thing about Newtonian mechanics is that if you change the properties of the system a little bit, you get a little bit of a change in the outcome. So you can see all of these orbits look just like each other. They're all ellipses. They have different masses going around them. They have different speeds, but they're basically the same morphology with gradual change. Now, also, another thing that was going on in Darwin's time was the steam engine, and the problems of optimizing the steam engine, getting things to heat up and getting the heat to be used efficiently. This was generating a nascent science of thermodynamics, which became very important in the physics of the 20th century. But Darwin really didn't know about this science. It was really just obscure, and there were only practical manifestations of it. Now, if we look in the upper right, we see a clockwork. That's a paradigm for a machine. Darwin wanted to stay away from things like this. I mean, this was not new science. There were clockworks and similar things back to the ancient times. But if you were trying to understand complex organisms, the clockwork was a natural model. Except at any time we encounter a clockwork or a machine like that, it's designed by people, and Darwin didn't want evolution to be designed. He wanted it to arise by natural processes. So then we look down at the Wedgwood pot on the lower right. Well, Josiah Wedgwood was Darwin's maternal grandfather. It was in his family. And there's this beautiful blue pot with this optimized, ideal ceramic composition. But it took Josiah Wedgwood thousands of attempts to get that color and to get the composition of the ceramic. This was trial and error, and this was the industrial model. It wasn't really a good science of materials, so you just changed things a little bit and you got little changes, and then you kept on doing it until you liked what you found. So in a way, this is Darwin's paradigm for how evolution changes: gradual, trial and error. Now, Lamarck had a different idea, and other natural philosophers of the 19th century. And instead of reading this long passage, I will let the English speakers read it off the screen, and I will let the translators tell you the Spanish version of it, and I'll just be quiet for a couple of moments. Okay, now, you can see what Lamarck is saying here. It's an idea of physics, but it's a physics that didn't exist in the 19th century when he was writing. Basically, it was pure speculation. He just imagined that things can do stuff like this. Ray Keller showed us that things can actually do things like this. They can rearrange and cut channels and form, act as fluids and so on. But this was speculation, and it was kind of marginalized in the scientific world. In fact, two philosophers of science, Depew and Weber, trying to explain Lamarck's ideas in the context of the physics of the time, one must learn to appreciate what was connoted by materialism of Lamarck's stripe or type, and how it differed from even the most reductionist forms of British thought. Viewed within the Newtonian framework, Lamarck's stress on the bootstrapping activities of organisms in bringing about their own complexity sounded as though they were to will their own adaptation. Think about the idea of Lamarck about the giraffe stretching his neck to get to the higher leaves and that being inherited. Well, it doesn't really happen that way, but Lamarck had different ideas about how matter can transform than the 19th century physicists and Darwin following them. Now, later in the 19th century, when more phenomena were available, there were other ideas. William Bateson was one of the early geneticists. He actually introduced the term genetics into the English language. And in a letter to his sister in 1891, he said, "Did I tell you anything about my new vibratory theory of repetition of parts in animals and plants? It is the best idea I have ever had or am likely to have. Divisions between segments, petals, and so on are internodal lines like those in sand figures made by sound." I'll show you an example in a moment. Hence, all the patterns and recurrence of patterns in animals and plants, hence the perfection of symmetry, hence bilaterality, symmetrical variation, and completeness of repetition, whether as a part, repeated, and so on. He says at the end, of course, heredity becomes quite a simple phenomenon in light of this. So basically, his idea, he believed in genes, but he believed that genes were mobilizing physical processes. And this sand patterns, these are called Chladni patterns. They look like turtle backs, but in fact, this was discovered in the 18th century. You just put some sand or powder on the back of a violin and you strike the strings, and depending on the tone, you get these patterns. And the patterns form spontaneously because of the energy agitating the matter. And you can actually predictably form structures like that. And Bateson thought that that was the paradigm, the new paradigm for segments and repeated patterns, the petals of plants and so on, fingers. Now, a major architect of the modern evolutionary synthesis, that is the version of Darwinism that includes population biology, Ernst Mayr, said, William Bateson's theory of an oscillatory basis of the inheritance of repetitive form simply retarded scientific progress. Okay? He hated it. He thought that was just the wrong way to go. Physics really had nothing to do with development or form. So jumping ahead to 1997, there was this paper, Avian Hairy Gene Expression Identifies a Molecular Clock Linked to Vertebrate Segmentation and Somatogenesis. That is the repetition of blocks of tissue along the axis of vertebrate organisms. In fact, Bateson was right. He didn't have the exact mechanism because he didn't know about chemical oscillations, but it was a clock, and it was a clock operating in an inhomogeneous environment that causes segments to form. And we know a lot more about this mechanism now, and the clock is always a central aspect in all organisms that have segments. So the modern synthesis was wrong in rejecting these ideas. Now, the African-American developmental biologist who worked in the early part of the 20th century, E.E. Just, who was famous for discovering the block to polyspermy during marine animal fertilization. and it's been generalized to other species, said physics has grown beyond classical physics, and the state of being alive is confined to that organization which is peculiar to it. What is needed is a physics and chemistry in a new dimension, superimposed upon the now known physics and chemistry. Now, we all know that the 20th century is associated with great revolutions in physics. There was relativity theory, which deals with very large phenomena and bodies, and quantum physics, which deals with very tiny things. But there was also a revolution in the physics of the middle scale, mesoscale, it's called. And these processes, some of which may be familiar to you, some of which may not, but these were all discovered during the 20th century, and they refer to materials that are on the scale of living embryos. So these phenomena were discovered in non-living systems, but they are associated with the kind of matter, the scale of matter that living embryos are. So there are what's called multi-stable dynamical systems, where things can jump abruptly between different chemical states or different dynamical states, nonlinear oscillations. I put the names of some of the scientists associated with these discoveries that may be familiar to you also. Reaction, diffusion, instabilities, and I'll be getting to that a little more. Phase separation and phase transitions, thermodynamics of open systems, nonlinear fluid mechanics, chaos theory, fractals, percolation, scaling, and soft matter theory, mechanochemical coupling, the coupling between chemistry and mechanics. Now, here's an example of phase separation. You have two immiscible liquids. This is not alive. It's just the dark one is water with a dye in it, and the light one is oil, and it's suspended in a second oil that it's non-miscible with. And when they come together, the one with the lower surface tension engulfs the one with the higher surface tension. And this always happens. So that's something, you don't need a lot of gradual change to get that morphology. It just happens because of the nature of the materials. In 1952, Turing, the famous computer scientist, published a paper called The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis. And what he said is that if you have chemicals with feedbacks activating and inhibiting each other's synthesis, and they are acting in a spatial domain, and the diffusion constants, the rate at which the chemicals diffuse, are different from each other, you can actually get patterns. So diffusion doesn't have to even things out. It can give you patterns. And I'll just give you an example of this. This is called the Belousov-Jabotinsky reaction, and it's a chemical reaction. It's not living, it's just chemicals reacting with each other and on a dish, and they form patterns. They form spirals, they form rings, they collide with each other, they interact, and that's just chemical reactions. And that's the principle of this is similar to what Turing described in his 1952 paper. So it's an amazing phenomenon, and we now know that in living embryos, such phenomena occur. Okay, I just want to show this